Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis Marcello Vitali Rosati. Je suis professeur ici à l'Université de Montréal au département de littérature de langue française et j'ai aussi l'honneur d'être directeur adjoint du CRIHN. Donc, je vous accueille et je lance cette table ronde et ce tour de présentation cet après-midi. Avant de commencer, je me permets de vous voler une minute juste pour raconter une anecdote personnelle avec Stéphane et qui a beaucoup marqué ma vie. En fait, donc c'était le 1er février 2012 et j'étais à Paris et quand je me suis levé le matin, je trouve un mail sur la liste d'IH francophone qui venait d'un certain, pour moi, Stéfan Sinclair. Je n'avais aucune idée de qui était Stéphane. Et en fait, dans ce mail, Stéphane fait appel à la communauté francophone pour que quelqu'un postule sur un poste à l'Université de Montréal. Moi, j'avais à peine une idée vague où était Montréal dans la carte. Donc et en fait, du coup, je lis le mail de Stéphane et un peu vite, et puis je lui écris en privé en disant, donc je ne le connaissais pas, hein, et je lui écris en privé en disant est-ce que vous auriez plus de détails sur ce poste, voici mon profil, est-ce que vous pensez que ça serait intéressant pour moi de postuler? Et il m'a répondu, je pense, en 2 minutes. Donc, c'était encore le 1er février, je me rappelle, j'étais sur les canapés de mon appartement à Paris et du coup, j'envoie les mails, il me répond tout de suite en me disant bah, moi, je suis pour rien parce que c'est pas mon université, je suis à McGill, mais en fait, écrivez à Francis Gingras, qui était directeur à l'époque de mon département, et il pourra vous donner plus d'informations, mais vraiment, faites-le parce que vous avez un CV qui, selon moi, fit avec les profils. Et donc, voilà, bah, c'est grâce à Stéphane que j'ai eu le poste. Et puis, ça a été une des premières personnes qui m'a accueilli ici dans la communauté des Digital Humanistes ici à Montréal. Et en fait, je pense que c'est une anecdote. Bon, évidemment, moi, ça compte beaucoup pour moi parce que je ne serais pas là si ce n'était pour ces mails. Mais ce mail dans la mailing list, dans ces mailing lists, en fait, je pense que ça représente bien l'envie de Stéphane de créer une communauté. You were talking about building community and this was really a strong involvement for Stéphane, even with people he didn't know about. I mean, I was nobody in the digital humanist community at the time, and it's thanks to Stéphane that I'm here. So, je ne sais pas s'il a rendu service à la communauté, mais ça, c'est de ma faute, pas la sienne. Voilà. Donc, je vous présente très, très rapidement les intervenantes et les intervenants de cet après-midi. Donc, Stéphane Pouillot, qui est au CNRS Humanum, donc dans la très grande infrastructure des recherches Humanum en France. Susan Brown, Université de Guelph, et Jeffrey Rockwell, Université d'Alberta. Et je vous laisse la parole sans plus de présentation. À vous. Merci.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, Marcello, and everybody else who organized today for holding this event. It's been hard. We've lost many people in many ways over the course of the pandemic, and this was a biggie. I want to talk about how Stéfan was a trailblazer in the digital humanities. And I know that we tend to use inflated rhetoric a lot in our field, but I do not think that I'm exaggerating. He was exemplary in many respects, and no one could do justice to them all in one talk. I'm just going to talk about a few of the ways in which his contributions resonate for me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about dogs. My first point has to do with niceness and accessibility. There's an influential blog post from a while back by Tom Scheinfeld called Why Digital Humanities is Nice. He says, one of the things that people often notice when they enter the field of digital humanities is how nice everybody is. This can be in stark contrast to other unnamed disciplines where suspicion, envy, and territoriality sometimes seem to rule. By contrast, our most commonly used bywords are collegiality, openness, and collaboration. We welcome new practitioners easily, and we don't seem to get in a lot of fights. we're the golden retrievers of the academy. And he goes on to say, okay, not always. There's more to be said. So the golden retrievers of the academy. I think of Stéfan as a lab guy because of Sable, his first dog, although I gather that Choco is a golden doodle. And he was a lab guy in more ways than one. He liked to do things in a lab, as well as resembling a lab, because he was truly one of the nicest human beings that I have ever known. But I think we do have to recognize, as Tom did in parentheses, but I think we've realized since he wrote that post much more forcefully, that DH is not equally nice to everyone. There are divisions in the DH community. It doesn't feel nice and equitable to everybody who tries to enter. We heard from Kim this morning about how amazing Stéfan was at sidling up to the person in the room who was standing by themselves and not talking to anybody, or you know, somebody who was new to the field. He was in a wonderfully understated way, just a welcoming committee in and of himself. And one of the things that we've realized as we started to talk about the divisions in our community is that one of the major issues has to do with access of various kinds. For instance, language. The dominance of English. Here I am speaking in English at a Francophone university and feeling ashamed of it. It carries with it the legacies of colonialism. It carries with it the realities of current power relations, global power relations. And Jeffrey would be able to speak to this in much more detail than I could, and talked about it a little bit at lunch, but I was always impressed by the care that Stéfan took to support Voyant in many languages. I don't know how many languages it exists in. I think many languages, right?
At least 9.
At least 9, right? So not just French, not just English, but anybody who wanted to make Voyant available in their language, he would support. And, you know, I occasionally bump into an interface in another language and try to struggle my way through it. There was one time after a conference in Japan when my browser decided that I was Japanese forever. And that took me a while to sort out. So I do have a tiny sense of how alienating it is to have to operate in an interface that is not in one's own language. So I have some sense of what this means to people. And I think it is typical of the kind of generosity that Stéfan showed as a DH practitioner. The world of DH is also inequitable when it comes to resources. Voyant runs online, and that's a very important form of accessibility right there. People don't have to download things. People don't have to configure things. They can just get going. But not everybody has the bandwidth to run Voyant online. So you can also download it and run it yourself. And this is, I think, crucial in areas of the global south, for instance, in areas where the connectivity that we take for granted is not available. And one of the things that I gathered when Kim and I went to the Global DH conference at the at Michigan State University a while back, it was a wonderful conference, and one of the insights that I came back with was the extent to which digital humanities projects beyond Europe and North America very often end up using mainstream tools, often social media tools. They use what is available, what works on phones, and put those tools to amazing uses. So you don't tend to see some of the more sophisticated, I'm putting that in quotation marks because I think people are using these tools for very sophisticated purposes, but you don't see some of the more complex, resource-heavy tools that many of us have the privilege to work with in European and North American contexts. But at that conference, the exception there was Voyant. It came up again and again and again, being put to fabulous uses having to do with all sorts of things, core research questions, social justice, community building, many different uses. And I think that that's another important aspect of accessibility. It is a phenomenally flexible tool. I'm on the, what used to be called NDRIO, now called the Digital Research Alliance Researchers Council, and working on the paper on research software. I was canvassing people on the council in the social sciences who could tell me about research software needs there. And somebody pointed me to a survey of tools that social sciences and interviews had identified as important to them. What do you know? Voyant was right in there along with NVivo as something that social scientists are using, which I had not really realized. So, you know, I think this is a really, really important aspect of what Stéfan did, of who he was and what he stood for within our community. And I've never talked to him about this, but I've always speculated that it might have something to do with growing up Francophone in Calgary, which might not have been the easiest thing to do. But he was always incredibly inclusive, incredibly welcoming. So that was my first point. My second has to do with, you know, very much picking up on another thing that Tim brought up this morning, making as an intellectual activity. Stéfan, with his fellow adventurer, Jeffrey, showed us all the extent to which making was a critical endeavor and how thoroughly collaborative it could be. And I think I met Stéfan through Jeffrey, being invited into the just-in-time research tools project when you were both at McMaster. Because not only were Stéfan and Jeffrey ongoing partners in what developed into Voyant, but they invited us to come along on their adventure. They were sharing as they went. I remember the excitement in the workshop I was offering alongside Stan Rucker at DHSI the summer that the beta version of Voyant was released. The workshop was about digital tools for literary study. And this is my memory, which I don't always trust, but I don't think we had any inkling that Voyant was coming. I don't think it was on our curriculum. And it just kind of like became the star of the course, because I think Stéfan sent a link or something like that. And we just all started playing around with it. And people were going, wow, this is it. This is so amazing. This is great. And it just kind of, you know, lodged in my memory as a moment of, you know, real discovery of what a great tool can do. People just dove in and started to play. And that was fantastic. I have heard of people denigrating the focus on making it points. We talked about this earlier a little bit. Our attitude to making in the digital humanities is, I think, one of our field's greatest strengths and one of its weaknesses. I think most of us have a strong regard and respect for it within the field. And I think we try to instill that respect in our students in a whole range of ways. But we have not managed to translate that regard for making to the institutions in which we work. And although the community appreciated him, Stéfan did not always get the recognition that he deserved. Some of his institutional struggles, as somebody who was brilliant, who was working at the rock face of making and thinking at the same time, and thinking through making and making through thinking, his institutional struggles, the fact that he had to struggle even when Voyant was a proven tool, even when you know, it was undoubtedly a success. That shows us how far we have to go in recognizing the value of this kind of work. Because even brilliant work can be overlooked in terms of what institutions and funding agencies are taught to value. And we are the people who are doing the judging. We are the people who are the peer reviewers. And we don't always make that case as well and as strongly as we should. And it was always apparent at conferences, at talks, at workshops, the immense intellectual engagement that Stéfan invested in Voyant and the pleasure that he took in this kind of work. And a big part of that pleasure was supporting others. I've argued elsewhere that there's a deep ambivalence about this kind of service within DH. I've argued that it's gendered, and we talked about, you know, the way that gender plays into the way that we think about tech in a range of ways. One of the things I loved about Stéfan was that he was always completely unapologetic, completely clear that that was where his priorities lay and that was what mattered. And I love the fact too that you could just mention that there was something in the interface that was just, you know, difficult to get around, awkward. And then he would just, like, a little while later, might be a year, might be a few months, he'd just say, hey, there's this thing. There's this whole new section to Voyant that solves the problem that you were looking at. Or you'd go to a conference and suddenly you'd see this new tool that he and Jeffrey and sometimes others had dreamed up. And I'm shouting out to the Dream Project there. I benefited hugely myself from his agility and his generosity as a collaborator, working with various experimental tools from the Mandala browser to the dynamic table of context, and then to the sustained work that we did together to build a bridge between Voyant and the Canadian Writing Research Collaboratory. And it wasn't just Voyant too, like I wanted to build a linked data browser, which became known as HuBiz, and he came along for the ride for a good while just because I had asked him if he would be involved, and we were working on some stuff together. And that's signal generosity. Next, I want to talk about success and about credit. I've heard it said by those comfortable with code that you can just do Voyant yourself because it uses a lot of open tools. It builds on a lot of libraries that are already out there. Yes, but Voyant has been called the gateway drug of text visualization because it is so easy to get up and running with it. And there is the thrill of being able to get going and see results fast and change things and modify them and configure them all in your browser without having to worry about the nuts and bolts and the machinery behind it. It's not a black box. There's documentation that explains what's going on and where the stuff came from and so on. The code is available, but it is easy to use. And I think the snobbery that sometimes underlies those sorts of attitudes overlooks the fact that, the web really took off, surprise, when GUIs were available. When you have a graphical user interface, it opens it up to a whole bunch of people. And Voyant allows you to see those possibilities so fast. The other thing that I think is brilliant about the GUI is that it juxtaposes things, right? The default skin lets you see things side by side in a way that you can't if you're just running one visualization program after another. It allows you to change that skin if you want to and modify things to suit what you're doing. And I think Jeffrey's going to talk about the notebook side of things, which takes you one step further towards the world of coding and programming if you want to go there. But Voyant on its own does a lot and really allows people to taste what text analysis and visualization is. And that's a crucial contribution and a reason for its success. And it can be counted as a huge success in terms of numbers of users. How many did you say a month? 15,000? Or 150,000?
Over 6 months, we had 150,000 over the last 6 months.
Right, 150,000 users over the last 6 months. Think of that in relation to how many people read a published, peer-reviewed university press book, folks. So it can be counted as a huge success in terms of numbers of users, the multilingual access, in terms of minimal computing, and crossing over into global DH in ways that few tools have done. Nor do many open source DH tools get appropriated for commercial purposes by corporations trying to shift digital humanities into their walled gardens of closed content without the credit that was due to its creators. Many of us were outraged on Stéfan's behalf at how this transpired, apparently considerably more than he was. He shrugged and made it clear that battling for recognition in this context wasn't something that he wanted to sink his time into. My sense was that he felt that he himself drew on other people's work and saw Voyant as part of this larger ecosystem, and he wanted to focus on the positive. And he was terrifically positive. I admire that about him, perhaps more than anything else about him. I was not aware of the Oulipo movement until I followed up on it out of curiosity about what Stéfan had focused on for his doctorate. Where did all this come from? And the more I learn about L'Ouvrier, I cannot say this, L'Ouvrier de Littérature Potentielle, the workshop for potential literature, the more apt it seems. The marriage of mathematics and algorithmic thinking with language and creativity, and the sheer fun of the challenges and of overcoming them, I think was a real inspiration to the whole series of tools that led into Voyant. I've got 2 more sections, and I hope that's okay in terms of time. We know Voyant is a huge success. It's the most used project on the Compute Canada cloud. It's been translated and downloaded and used again and again in teaching. And yet at this point in time, although we have hopes and we have schemes, without Stéfan, it's not clear how Voyant is going to be sustained. It reminds us how fragile what we have built is. I remember how sad Kim was during the process of selling the Maker Bus. And it's wonderful to think that Humanities Matter 2 will be up and running at some point in the future, and amazing to think that it is going to be a tribute to Stéfan, but that should have been a choice, not something that was, you know, an inevitability. And unfortunately, that is, you know, the situation in which DH tools generally live. The digital requires care and repair of the kind that Stéfan put in year after year, not just for Voyant, not over all those years in which Voyant carefully through workshops, through communication building, through support, built up this amazing global user base. But for instance, the servers and other infrastructure of the Canadian Society for Digital Humanities, la Société Canadienne des Humanités Numériques, he literally kept us going in an unostentatious, collegial, characteristically self-effacing way. And that kind of work needs more respect and recognition, and it also needs more resources so that it doesn't happen as often as it does, and so that good tools don't risk disappearing when one person goes, which is so often the case. Stéfan's reach and impact were so great that I could go on and on, but I'm going to wrap up very quickly because I'd like to hear what Jeffrey and Stéfan have to say, and I want to move into the conversation. So what I want to do here at the end is to talk personally about what it meant to lose Stéfan. And I think my feelings are probably shared by many in this room and zooming in. The last note that I received from Stéfan in July 2020, he was, as many of us know, intensely private. I think many people were not aware that he was even ill. I know that. And I think we tried to respect that while worrying intensely about what was happening. So I did not know when I received that note how close to the end of his life he was, and what a struggle it must have been, how painful it must have been to write it, what it would have cost him. There was one line of business in that email, which was trivial, but this is why he had written. He said, "I'm writing belatedly to offer my sincerest condolences for the loss of your dog. I know how they become members of the family, and it can be devastating to have them pass away. Then we deal with months or more of feeling the hole in your daily habits and the absence of a beloved being. I hope you and your family find strength during this very difficult time." This was Stéfan, through and through, direct, caring, cutting to the chase, talking about what mattered. It's been 16 months. I didn't have anything like daily contact with Stéfan. I did not go for walks with him daily, or, you know, we were not in each other's daily routines. But he was there every day as a central figure in my sense of the professional universe that I inhabit and of the very best that digital humanities can be. I know many of us feel the hole in our daily habits in that way and the absence of a beloved being. Thank you for being here, whether you are here in person or connecting with us online, to honor him today.
Alors, merci beaucoup c'est difficile de parler après celui-là. Merci beaucoup à McGill, au CRIHN, aussi au mot que Marcelo a dit tout à l'heure pour cette invitation aussi. Moi, je vais juste évoquer une rencontre avec Stéphane, alors, à la fois la première, qui, je dois dire, m'a marqué, parce que, alors je ne sais pas parce qu'on s'appelle Stéphane tous les deux, mais on est à peu près de la même génération. Et en fait, à la première rencontre avec Stéphane, j'ai compris une chose, c'est qu'on était de la même génération, celle du web. En fait. Et c'est ça qui m'a marqué quand j'ai rencontré Stéphane. La première diapo. La suivante. En fait, la première rencontre, elle est apparue un peu comme ça par hasard, à l'initiative de McGill d'ailleurs. J'avais profité de mon premier passage à Montréal en 2015 pour organiser une petite présentation de l'un des objets que j'ai créé, qui s'appelle Isidore, qui est un moteur de recherche pour les sciences sociales. Et lors de la présentation de l'outil, ici à l'Université de Montréal, organisée par McGill, Stéphane était là, il était venu, et tout de suite, on a commencé à échanger. Et je dois dire que le contact a été direct, et ça a tout de suite accroché avec Stéphane. Il m'a tout de suite branché sur Voyant, etc., que je connaissais de très loin, vaguement. Et j'ai tout de suite échangé avec lui sur ce potentiel de l'outil. Et ce qu'on avait en commun, c'est très vite est apparu, c'était la passion du web, c'est-à-dire de mettre à disposition en libre accès sur le web des outils pour que les gens travaillent. Et comme l'a dit très bien ce matin Kim, créer des communautés. Et voilà, on est parti là-dessus et on a tout de suite échangé. Diapo suivante. Et nous, moi, avec mon équipe, on a commencé à réfléchir à ce qu'on pouvait faire avec Voyant et qu'est-ce qu'il amenait dans notre processus, qu'est-ce qu'il amenait dans notre écosystème. Et très vite, Voyant est arrivé comme un objet qu'on n'avait pas prévu du tout dans notre écosystème, ou qu'on avait prévu, mais enfin qu'on avait un peu fantasmé, un peu rêvé. Et puis il est arrivé là, comme ça, sur un plateau. Et j'ai dit, mais c'est extraordinaire parce qu'on va pouvoir en faire plein de choses. Et voilà. Et donc on a commencé à réfléchir avec Stéphane à comment on pouvait intégrer Voyant dans notre écosystème. Alors, ça n'a pas été forcément évident tout de suite parce que Voyant n'était pas en français à l'époque. Aurélien Béra s'est attaqué assez rapidement à la traduction française avec la communauté BH, diapo suivante. Et assez rapidement est arrivée l'idée avec Stéphane qu'on pouvait proposer de faire de Voyant un miroir et de le proposer sous forme d'un miroir dans notre infrastructure. Et on s'était dit, je me souviens d'un échange par mail avec Stéphane, en disant c'est la première marche d'une collaboration. Ça ne coûtait pas cher pour nous de le proposer, de mettre de la puissance de calcul derrière Voyant, des espaces de stockage. Et je me souviens d'une discussion avec avec mon équipe, et puis mon chef de projet, Laurent Capilli. Je lui disais, mais bon, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? On peut proposer Voyant en miroir? Oui, bien sûr. C'est facile. Et puis, à la fin de la réunion, 20 minutes après, c'était fait. On avait un premier miroir. On a boulonné tout ça. On a boulonné tout ça. Et puis, on a commencé à le proposer à nos utilisateurs. On est une infrastructure de recherche. On travaille avec des centaines de milliers de chercheurs en France et de par le monde. Et très vite, Voyant est arrivé comme un dispositif qu'on a intégré dans notre proposition. Et on est allé assez loin puisqu'on en parle même dans notre documentation technique. C'est l'une des briques que l'on propose pour faire du traitement, de la révélation de texte, comme le disait Stéphane. Et assez rapidement, cette première collaboration, elle a commencé à prendre beaucoup de place. On a commencé à faire des ateliers à former des chercheurs autour de cet outil-là, à voir ce qu'ils pouvaient faire avec. Et donc, c'est un outil qui est arrivé par la passion du web, que je pense je partageais avec Stéphane. Et souvent, quand on pilote et quand on dirige une infrastructure comme celle du Manu, que j'ai moins maintenant parce que je suis dans un lab, mais à l'époque j'étais directeur technique de l'infrastructure, il y a toujours des logiciels qui arrivent, qui sont demandés par les communautés, et c'est toujours compliqué de les faire fonctionner, d'imaginer leur modèle économique, leur exploitation. Voilà. Et puis Voyant, pas du tout. Voyant, c'est arrivé comme ça, et puis la générosité évidemment de Stéphane, qui était immense, a fait que ça s'est tout de suite bien passé. Et c'était un impact très important pour les communautés qui sont des communautés utilisatrices. Diapo suivante. Alors, assez rapidement, on a intégré Voyant tous dans notre écosystème. Et quand on a repensé notre écosystème il y a 2 ans, il y a 2 ans, on s'est dit, ben voilà, finalement, cet outil-là, il a une place, même s'il n'est pas fabriqué par nous, il a une place au sein de l'écosystème. Et puis, on voyait que nos utilisateurs le travaillaient, le demandaient, nous demandaient des explications sur son évolution, etc. Diapo suivante. Donc, quand on a refait notre infrastructure, qu'on a repensé notre dispositif, on a essayé de scénariser le travail sur les données de la recherche en numérique. Diapo suivante. Et en fait, Voyant tous, il est arrivé dans notre processus et il a trouvé sa place naturellement, j'ai envie de dire, dans notre processus. Alors, ce n'est pas le seul outil, évidemment. À peu près à la même époque, Stylo est arrivé aussi. Mais Voyant a trouvé sa place naturelle. Et je me souviens de la réunion où on a finalisé ce schéma-là que j'ai mis sur la diapo. C'était une réunion tendue. Il y avait des gens qui étaient d'accord, d'autres qui n'étaient pas d'accord, ça discutait, etc. Mais par contre, parmi mes collègues, alors qui sont des informaticiens, qui sont des développeurs, des sysadmins, aussi des chercheurs en sciences humaines et en sciences sociales, qui ne sont pas trop humanité numérique, mais voilà, d'autres chercheurs plus digital humanistes, il y avait quand même une unanimité sur Voyant, en disant, bah oui, cet outil-là, il est là et il est dans l'écosystème de notre infrastructure et il a sa place. Voilà. Il n'y a pas trop eu de discussion sur la place de Voyant tous dans notre infrastructure, alors qu'on s'est battu pour plein d'autres choses. Alors, sur le futur, avant que Stéphane ne parte, on avait réfléchi à qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire de Voyant tous dans l'écosystème du Manu. Et on avait pensé le déployer, le distiller sous la forme d'un bouton Voyant tous. On appelait ça, je lui disais, fais-moi un bouton Voyant tous que je peux mettre dans toutes mes applications pour révéler les textes. C'est-à-dire qu'à chaque fois que j'ai du texte intégral, que soit le chercheur est en train de l'écrire avec un outil comme Stylo, Marcello, qu'on a intégré récemment dans une annuelle. Et je disais à Stéphane, fais-moi un bouton Voyant tous, fais-moi un bouton Voyant tous que je puisse le mettre dans mes différentes applications, Nakala pour les données de la recherche, Isidore pour le moteur de recherche, etc. Et le suivant. Donc on avait vraiment commencé à réfléchir sur cette mise à disposition, alors soit sous la forme d'un bouton, d'une fonctionnalité déportée, d'une API, on a commencé à réfléchir. Et l'un des aboutissements de cette réflexion est en train de se faire en ce moment avec notre projet Callisto, qui est une instance pour écrire, pour que les chercheurs écrivent des articles exécutables, des executed papers, comme on dit. Et évidemment, Voyant tous à sa place dans ce dispositif. Je pense que je peux en parler, mais ces nouveaux modes d'édition des données, autour des données, qui sont les data papers, les executed papers, on est en train de définir des nouveaux objets de littérature scientifique, de partage du savoir, et ces nouveaux supports en fait intègrent beaucoup de choses que Stéphane avait mis dans Voyant tous et que maintenant on peut déporter assez facilement dans différents dispositifs. Et donc, avec le départ de Stéphane, moi j'ai tout de suite pensé à ce qu'on appelle beaucoup dans les projets européens aussi la sustainability de cet outil-là. Et je pense que nous, Emmanuel, en France, c'est un outil qui est parmi nous depuis un moment maintenant, et on aimerait beaucoup participer à sa maintenance et à son évolution, parce que je sais que c'est un outil qui est place parmi nos utilisateurs. Alors, en espérant qu'on puisse aider avec les moyens que nous avons à Emmanuel, sous la forme d'une collaboration internationale, sans doute, pour continuer à développer cet outil fantastique. Juste dire merci à Stéphane pour nous avoir doté les digital humanistes de ce fantastique outil qui est Voyant tous, et qu'on a plaisir tous les jours à proposer à nos utilisateurs. Merci. Merci.
Actually, a few of the slides I can so that's what we see. So thank you all for being patient. Is it okay if I start here and then choose a camera set? What I wanted to do is actually show you what Stéfan was working on in the last couple of years. So this is a notebook that I put together using Spyral to study the discourse around COVID in Alberta. We've been gathering the speeches by the Première. We've been gathering the speeches by the Chief Health Officer, Dina Hinshaw. We've been gathering web pages for news stories. We've been gathering Twitter. And I wanted to figure out how I could sort of study these different sort of text streams. And I brought them together into Spyral, also to, in some sense, test Spyral. And this is a working notebook, in effect, that I've been playing with it. And I want to show you some of the things that Spyral can do. So first of all, you'll notice that it is a notebook a lot like IPython notebooks in Jupyter or Colab, or some of you have ever played with Mathematica or Observable. So it's a notebook that allows you to have a sequence of text cells in which you can talk about what you're doing, and code cells, which will then output. But there's one major difference, that these cells can actually produce working Voyant displays, not passive displays, but actual dynamic ones that could be manipulated. So for example, what you see here is I'm trying to trace a bunch of different themes. Oh.
Right, it works online, but not here. I'm not sure why not. So just nobody can see it in the room. So
nobody can see it. Okay,
you know, they can online.
Okay, so well,
that's weird. I don't know why. I'm struggling with the tech guy left, but why now we're not seeing both?
Doesn't matter. I'm going to switch then back to my slides.
I'll just I'll put the slide and you can go in front of the camera to see you.
So I can circulate the link because this thing is up and open. But if you could, are we seeing? Now we're stuck seeing. Yeah.
This is what my teaching was like whole semester.
Yes, I don't know if you guys have this problem in teaching. You switch from PowerPoint to something else, and you're happily talking and showing something, and then one of the students finally puts up their hand and goes, "Excuse me, Mr. Rockwell, you're still on the PowerPoint. The thing is happening on the second screen." Anyway, I'm just going to I'll just talk about it. So we're using this this notebook environment. It allows us to do a couple of things that you can't do in Voyant. So it allows me to actually have to document a series of different Voyant panels with information about exactly how I got those panels, all in a sequence. It allows me to make an argument about the data I have. It allows me to work with more than one corpus. So you can see right here that in fact I have a series of different corpora. Many of them reuse the same text, but are different combinations, so I can compare. How does our Premiere talk about COVID versus the health officer? How does the Premiere talk about energy versus the health officer? So I can have, there we go. Next screen, one more. So these notebooks allow me to bring together into one place and to document a series of experiments and inferences. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the Spyral notebooks. First of all, they are extensions of Voyant. So if I were able to show this live, I could show you how the panels that you embed are living panels. These aren't sort of exported SVG graphics that you dropped into your Microsoft Word paper. They are, I like your phrase about this sort of a new type of writing, where in some sense the writing is not just, I don't want to say passive text, it's not just text, but it is activated text, or it has components which are interactive. As I mentioned, these notebooks have text blocks, code blocks, and output, just like any notebook environment that you're used to using. We do actually have an additional element that you can have fields where you can put information. So you can have a process which will do something, produce some results, which you can then edit and then use in the next process. So you can actually have sort of interactive fields like lists of words that you're chasing after. Next slide, please. The thing that I think Stéfan was, in some ways, it was a very simple idea, but something that he was very proud of, and which was very important to him, was the fact that you can generate a Spyral notebook from within Voyant. It's now inside, even now as we speak, it's inside the export panel. So if you're seeing some interesting results, you can go to the export. You can click on a button that says a new Spyral notebook, and it will produce the code that would give you exactly that panel. And if you think about it, if you're an instructor or a student or a researcher, you can take that code and you can start maintaining that code in a notebook or in your own notebook or wherever it is. And you can maintain, if you will, a history of the different operations that you've done, and you can begin to build them up. And the pedagogical side of this, because Stéfan and I would spend a lot of time talking about the teaching of text analysis, the pedagogical side of this was that we could now start asking our students to write these online papers where they showed us the research they were doing, the analysis they were doing, they documented it, they explained what they're doing, they made an argument. And for those of you who probably taught text analysis, you spend a lot of time trying to show students how to make something work at all. And then you're trying to make the shift to getting them to think through this technology and to then argue it and in some sense document what they're doing. And that's what you want to have at the end of the day. So this was where we were heading with this, was we were trying to build a tool with which we could teach. We also thought of it as a pathway for students, because we would get a lot of students and colleagues who would hit a wall. There was some feature they wanted that Voyant did not have. And we thought of this as a way of giving a pathway so that people could take it beyond. They could, if they really wanted to get a slightly different visualization, this has D3 built in. You can sort of export the parts you want to Voyant, and then you can write your own JavaScript code and get that. Can I have the next one? So now I've talked a bit about the notebook environment. Those of you who've used Jupyter, IPython, something like that, probably have a sense of what we're doing. Though it is JavaScript, not Python. I now want to sort of step back and talk a little bit about the thinking that was going on behind what Stéfan was building in Spyral. First of all, he was inspired by Knuth's idea of literate programming. This was an idea that was sort of traveling. Stephen Ramsey, myself, Stéfan, other people were very interested in the question of what sort of programming would be appropriate for people in the humanities. And Knuth's idea from this 1984 paper on literate programming appealed to us because it was a different paradigm. And it's a paradigm that has actually become quite popular now with the sort of the growth of big data and data analytics. Next slide. But the reason why we ended up with Spyral and literate programming was because of a series of experiments that he and I started doing. And I should go back a little bit and say that he and I had developed a praxis of collaboration where we would, when we're both at McMaster, we would get together in a lab and actually do sort of a version of pair programming or pair text analysis. So the two people together for a day or half a day or 2 hours or whatever it was, and we'd work on various problems to be continually trying stuff out. Once we separated, we were doing this over Skype and then Zoom and stuff like that. But we started to do, we began to ask ourselves, wouldn't it be interesting to look at the tools, the history of the tools that we are now playing with, and go back and find some of the original papers, some of the original experiments. And so here I give an example, the keyword in context, which I think the thing is sort of, it's sort of covering, but it goes back to a paper from 1966 from Loon about keyword in context indices. And what we decided to try to do was to see if we could replicate these early experiments. Could we actually create a keyword in context similar to the one that Loon created? He was working on a mainframe. We're not working on a mainframe, but could we actually understand what he was thinking and this basic technology? And if you think about it, this is the technology that we get Google results in. This is a technology that has become so obvious that we no longer notice it. But one of the ways to understand these obvious technologies is to try to go back and understand them as they were developed in their context. And so we started a series of these experiments, and some of you probably heard papers in which we talked about what we were trying with and so on like that. Next slide, please. And that's what led us to then stepping back. So we had these experiments we wanted to run. And then we figured we were doing them in Python, we were trying out Mathematica, and eventually that's when it led us to Spyral. Okay, let's build our own environment so that other people can start doing the same types of experiments that we're doing, the same replications. And these replications, I should say, by the way, we don't think of them as the way reproducibility is thought about in the scientific world. We're not trying to test whether or not Loom was right or not. What we're trying to do is something much closer to sort of philology, of trying to understand the technology, the practice, as it was understood in its time, as a way of unpacking these knowledge things. And hence we started playing with the word epistemologica, that we're surrounded nowadays by these knowledge things, these things that constrain and structure our knowledge that we take for granted. And we need ways to unpack them. And that's where sort of the thinking behind Spyral came. If I can, I wanted to point out this pyramid, because in that pyramid, the moment you ask yourself, what are the assumptions in that data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, which you've probably all seen and so many people take for granted. The moment you ask yourself about the assumptions, you realize that that pyramid, which in some ways underlies a lot of the big data rhetoric, is an argument that the more data you have, the more information you'll have. And the more information you'll have, the more knowledge you'll have. And the more knowledge you'll have, the more wisdom. And that's nonsense. There's no philosophical reasoning behind that, but we all sort of take it for granted. You know, get more data and you'll get more knowledge and wisdom and something like that. So this Spyral ultimately is meant to be a utility to help start unpacking these assumptions and to unpack them through replication as a form of building, not just unpacking them the way, if you will, critical theorists might, but unpack them the way a media archaeologist would. And that's sort of what we're trying to do. And we went back to Gilbert Ryle and his distinction between knowing how and knowing that, which sort of maps onto the hack and yak, but not entirely. And that part of what we're trying to do is to figure out how to unpack the knowing how, not just the knowing that. And another person, of course, who's important here in Quebec is Lyotard's postmodern condition. And he, in some ways, lays out the issue of how knowledge is being changed. And our ideas about what knowledge is being changed by the structures of information that we're building. Last slide. So where are we now? So the question now is, how do we maintain this legacy? How do we finish developing what Stéfan started? And this is something where we're very fortunate to have the support of Links, to have partners like Humanum, to have all sorts of people that are interested. But the reality of this infrastructure is that if people do not pay attention, if we don't work on it, it will vanish. I'm not sure that's entirely a problem, but I think Spyral at least is worth finishing. And I've gathered together, these are some of the things that really mattered to Stéfan when he was developing Voyant. And I think apply also to what we're trying to do with Spyral. This is some of his sort of philosophy of what he was trying to do, starting with the idea of we should be building tools that are sensitive to the ways in which textual scholars think of and interact with text. Extensibility, skinability, and Spyral is very much a different skin, if you will, to Voyant. And referenceability, the ability, and this is common to humanists going back to the Italian Renaissance, you know, the ability to always get back to your original sources, to know what the references were. Last slide. And that's more or less it. So thank you very much. You can play right now with Spyral. This is up and open, and there you are. Thank you. And I apologize for the failed demonstration. You think after all these years, I didn't solve that problem.
On a le temps pour une discussion avec nos intervenants. Donc, je vous laisse la parole d'abord pour la prendre aussi personnellement. Je vais commencer avec quelques questions sur Spyral, en fait. Sur Spyral et sur une question très précise à propos aussi de Stéfan et de certains choix techniques, en particulier JavaScript. Quelles étaient les raisons de cette prédilection pour JavaScript? Ça m'intéresse beaucoup.
So I'll first describe the history of that decision and then some of the reasoning behind it. So we started these series in our practice was always these sort of iterative experiments, and we started in Python. We were doing everything and in fact, I can point you to some the art of literary programming that Stéfan wrote, and I helped a bit, but it's really his work in Python. And he began to hit some walls with Python, but the main thing was trying to figure out how to integrate it with Voyant. And so Voyant right now, the interface is JavaScript. So, the simple answer is the easiest way, given that, remember, Spyral is not a new program. It is an extension, a new face to Voyant. And given that all the interface stuff is already done in JavaScript, he's got D3, and all the stuff is there. It was much easier to do it to have the programming language to be JavaScript. There was an intermediate step where we tried building an API so that you could call Voyant from something else. And I believe that the skeleton of that is there, but that wasn't working quite as smoothly as he wanted to. And he could get it working with JavaScript, and he liked JavaScript. I asked him the same question. And because I knew Python, I was teaching Python, and he's been, I'm now learning JavaScript. And I still, for the life of me, there are aspects of JavaScript that still elude me. The whole business of everything being concurrent, and he just loved that. And yeah.
Thank you very much.
I was going to show, in that notebook.
Try again.
Well, no, it's not. But I was going to show, because one of the things he did is we've got a great example of how some code can give you a new a visualization that you can't get in Voyant, and how that in effect extends. And it's something that, in some sense, I think is. It would probably be easier to do. I don't know for sure, but easier to do. So can you just scroll down to the bottom and of that? Yeah, keep on going. There. So this is for each of the weeks that we've been gathering this live corpus. This is the ranked TF-IDF for each week, and I'd have to run it, but if you roll over a word, you can actually, it'll highlight the word in all the weeks. So you actually see you can almost see like a little graph, but it allows you to see all those ranked TF-IDFs all in one place, which in Voyant, you would have to export them to like Excel, then assemble them all. Whereas, about 40 lines of code. And you can start, you can extend it. So a long answer to your question, I apologize.
Well, thank you very much. I'm starting playing that. But I'm struggling with JavaScript. I will ask Olivier, who is good in JavaScript.
So I want to say I gave you the wrong.
There's a question from you from François Lachance asking Jeffrey about, and I quote, is JavaScript a language peculiarly suited to dialogue between readers of text and between readers?
What a great question.
He smiles next to that question. So I think,
François knows my predilections. JavaScript. One of the things that JavaScript is very good at is visualization because of libraries like D3. And Stéfan paid a lot of attention to the visual and interactive. That was, and for, if you will, the dialogue between the human and the computer. And I think this is one of the things that made Voyant particularly attractive to people new to text analysis, was the incredible variety of visualizations that you could play with. And play was important to him. As Susan said, his PhD thesis was on movement. he was, from the beginning, he was thinking about play. And we often use the word toys instead of tools. So that would be my answer, my first one, but I'm going to have to think about it.
Il y a un aspect très important en design aussi, je pense. Ces librairies JavaScript, c'est vraiment des... Il y a des effets de mode aussi, c'est-à-dire que les besoins apparaissent et sont un peu conditionnés par ce que les développeurs amènent dans ces dispositifs-là. Et tu disais à l'instant, c'est vrai qu'on porte beaucoup d'attention au design et à la possibilité de jouer en faisant parler les données traitées, mais c'est aussi parce qu'on visualise des choses qu'on a envie de reproduire dans ces outils-là. Il y a un travail de convergence en fait, vers ces librairies-là aussi. Et d'autres librairies qui font à peu près le même boulot sur le plan fonctionnel ne le font pas complètement de la même façon sur le plan visuel. Et du coup, ça entraîne les développements des outils vers qu'on pourrait appeler la fabrication de standards, mais dans le bon sens du terme, c'est-à-dire pas dans le sens enfermé, mais dans le sens où on gagne tous à pouvoir aussi avoir des outils et des dispositifs qu'on peut comparer et qu'on peut et du coup critiquer derrière. Et ce que je disais tout à l'heure, Voyant, certains choix graphiques dans Voyant ont beaucoup conditionné par mon équipe des réflexions quand on a refait un certain brique dans nos outils. Les développeurs sont allés chercher comme référence Voyant, c'est-à-dire qu'ils ont dit oui, mais dans Voyant c'est comme ça a été fait comme ça, ou c'est présenté comme ça, ou c'est voilà. Et donc voilà, c'était un point de référence aussi. Il y avait d'autres points de référence, mais Voyant en était un. Je pense que ça c'est important. Au-delà de la technologie, JavaScript n'a pas tout dit sur
Il a levé la main en premier.
C'est pas du sexy. Je peux poser ma question en français ou
Oui, on va essayer.
Je ferai deux versions s'il faut. C'était une question peut-être un peu plus large en lien aussi avec la présentation de Kim ce matin. Geoffrey, vous évoquiez la question que certains outils étaient peut-être beaucoup plus consultés que certains papiers qu'on écrit. Est-ce que ça veut dire que dans le domaine des humanités numériques, il n'y aurait pas une injonction, une obligation à produire absolument des outils? Et je pose cette question en lien avec justement des outils de prototypage, comme on l'a vu avec ces notebooks, qui nous permettent de pouvoir tester des choses, de pouvoir montrer. C'est juste une réflexion que je me pose comme ça sur le lien justement qu'on peut avoir entre des outils qui sont très bien, comme Voyant tout, qui est vraiment un très bon exemple justement d'un projet très abouti, que tout le monde peut utiliser, qui est très ouvert, et d'autres projets qui vont finalement jamais être totalement terminés parce qu'on manque de temps, on manque d'argent, et comment nous, étudiants et étudiantes, on se positionne par rapport à ça, parce que des fois on produit un petit machin qui ne marche pas complètement, mais on ne sait pas trop quoi en faire, on a envie de le montrer à la terre entière, mais donc voilà, c'était juste une question que je me posais comme ça, qui est en lien aussi avec l'héritage que laisse Stéphane et des outils aussi qu'on peut réutiliser, qu'on peut forquer.
Moi, juste sur une partie, Antoine, moi je pense, sur la première partie de ta question sur l'injonction par rapport aux outils, et, moi je pense depuis très très longtemps que la question, c'est pas la question de l'écriture du papier ou de l'écriture de l'outil, faut-il les opposer Par contre, il y a un élément, je trouve, qui est important, c'est que finalement, des dispositifs sociotechniques, comme on les appelle dans le jargon, on va dire, sont en train de converger vers finalement une fusion entre l'article scientifique et l'outil. Parce que finalement, les cellules des notebooks C'est de l'écriture, au sens plein et entier. C'est de l'exécution de code, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a toute la problématique en fait de l'environnement, de la critique de l'environnement dans lequel le code s'exécute et comment il s'exécute et avec quel dispositif derrière. Mais en fait, du coup, on est quasiment dans ces notebooks la fusion entre du texte statique à destination d'un lectorat. Alors, ce lectorat, il est humain ou il n'est pas humain, hein. Mais enfin, ça peut être des outils d'annotation sémantique, des choses comme ça qui lisent les textes. C'est pas forcément les textes, on les écrit plus forcément pour des humains, on les écrit aussi pour des machines. Et le code qui s'exécute, donc on est. Moi, je fais attention maintenant à plus jamais opposer outils et écrit, parce que avec ces dispositifs-là, finalement, il y a une espèce de fusion quand même.
Hybridation.
Hybridation. Bon, voilà,
pas pour les comités d'évaluation.
Ça, c'est sûr.
If I could try to answer that, because I think that gets at some of what I was trying to talk about. So first of all, just pragmatically, one of the reasons Stéfan and I teamed up together was to try to develop a way of doing this sort of knowledge work, but also get credit for it. So we made a practice of building a tool like Voyant and then publishing a book from MIT Press. And they're both, you know, he's the lead author on one and I'm the lead author on the other. So that was just a pragmatic issue of how to make sure that we were both getting credit for work. The second thing you mentioned, prototypes, and there's a very important, there's a great article by Alan Bailey and Stan Rucker. And I think that's actually a very important part of the thing about a prototype, for that knowledge to be useful to other people, assuming that they can never run the prototype, it's only you who can run it. There has to be documentation sufficient to carry the knowledge of what you learned. And so that's where the notebooks come in, because our notebooks are designed so that if you literally just printed it out, you would have enough code, you'd have the output visualizations, you'd have the descriptions such that even if the underlying infrastructure vanishes, I think you would have enough to be able to replicate, which gets me back to replication. So there we were trying to replicate projects that people had done with code, and we continually came up to what was missing. One that we talked about in hermeneutica was John B. Smith's sort of study of James Joyce. And he draws all these inferences, but he's missing big chunks of what you need to know in order to be able to actually reproduce it. John B. Smith is actually still alive. He's in his 90s. So we called him up and said, where's your list of words? You know, oh, I don't know. It was a long time ago. So those are, and that's where in the replication is when you realize the lacunae, the things that are missing, what you don't know, what's not in the prototype, what's not in the visualization. So that's where the practice of replication becomes a way about thinking how tools bear knowledge differently than a book. A book is that knowledge, that propositional knowledge. In some ways, the tools are knowledge how, or the socio-technical aggregation of tools, practices, people is the how.
So I very much agree with what you both have said, so far as I understood what you said, and so far as I understood the question. I do think we have to have a pretty broad notion of sort of making or building or prototyping, because I think not everybody is going to engage with tools in the same way. But I do think that as a field, the digital humanities is about a non-naive engagement or interaction with the tools that are shaping our knowledge in one way or another. So I don't think it necessarily means everyone has to code, but I think we have to get below the surface of the interface. We have to understand what's going on and engage with that in productive ways that are sort of different from a straightforward critique. So I think that's crucial. And I mean, by analogy with the book, you wouldn't imagine a contribution to knowledge about the book that didn't involve writing and understanding what writing was and being able to use writing as a tool and being able to use the book as, this is what you were suggesting, using the book as a technology. And the knowledge technologies of our time are digital texts and digital objects. And we, I think, are engaged in the process of trying to figure that out in a whole range of ways as users and as builders. I think too that there's again that spectrum, right? When I was talking about Voyant, from the person who just like plops in their research paper or plops in their text that they love the best and sees what comes out and says, "Ooh, this is really exciting," and they may move on to do something more with other tools or to start programming in a notebook, and they may get bitten by the code bug and take it and run with it. But I also think that as long as they can understand what they've done and what that tool was doing, and it's not just a black box like a Wordle that is just spitting out something pretty, but you don't really have the ability to get back to what it's referencing. You don't have the ability to examine the relationship between what comes out of the interface and the data. You don't have the documentation that explains how stop words are working, or things. In other words, if it's transparent and there's the ability to dig into it and potentially down the line to replicate it, I think that's a perfectly valid approach. And what a lot of people in the humanities, not necessarily the digital humanities, need are those sorts of tools that really make it possible to use them with confidence and with understanding.
C'était pas vraiment une question, encore une fois, c'était plus une anecdote ou un partage d'illustration. Je trouve que Voyant, je parle pas assez fort. Je vais parler en français, mais je préfère je trouve que Voyant répond à cette question aussi de la lisibilité et de combien on peut lire. Moi, j'ai utilisé par exemple Voyant pour avoir des visuels de 100 milliards de poèmes de Queneau, et justement la question de l'hypo se posait. Mais on l'a aussi utilisé lorsqu'on a fait une performance d'écriture collaborative, et qu'en 1 heure, avec 30 personnes qui écrivaient sur un pad collaboratif, on se retrouvait avec des pages et des pages que scientifiquement, il n'était pas intéressant de résumer, mais dont il fallait quand même donner un visuel, une perspective sur ce qui avait été produit comme terme et comme réflexion. Et donc, on a utilisé Voyant pour ça aussi. Du coup, je trouvais que c'était la question avec l'hypo et la lisibilité, et puis à la fois la représentation d'une vraie expérience d'écriture semblait correspondre à ça. C'est juste
And the predecessor of Voyant was called Hyperpo. I mean, I can show you and Stéfan was very aware of the playfulness, and I think he wrote Hyperpo as part of his PhD thesis, and and he loved to play around. He loved to surprise me. We would have these weekly sort of meetings, and I'd be all work, and he would go, "Oh, I got something to show you," and it was.
I had a question, consideration about the relationship between, which seems to me very central for us today. In Kim's speech and in your presentation, it's the relationship between, I would say, people, and in particular Stéfan, who I think is a really perfect example of that, people, communities, and tools. And tools not like tools, but like spaces that we can inhabit like a community, as a community. So that's I think something which everybody was speaking about today. So there is somebody or a bunch of people working together, and this the fact of working together let emerge something, a tool or a space, actually like Voyant, and then this tool, this space becomes something which allows communities to emerge. Because we are there, we are on Voyant, we are on GitLab or on your GitLab and so on. So this is the consideration, but there is a question, and it is what I was talking with Kim doing before, is how can we struggle with, you were talking about that, with GAFAM and big spaces and social networks which are wonderful for some aspects, like Twitter or whatever, but actually which poses a lot of problems about us as community, because we are not the one who are producing these spaces. And so they do not represent our points of view, our needs, our views, our values too, which is done by a tool like Voyant, and we can feel it. I mean, it's really different, and we are home actually, and we aren't home on Twitter. We can act in order to make it feel like home, but it's not. So I don't know how, as a community, I mean, it's your job actually, a little bit. But I would like to hear you about these considerations.
Yeah, well, it's the means of production, isn't it? Surveillance capitalism is, you know, we are the product when we're on those platforms. We are not the producers. We are not, you know, the end of it is not produced for our ends. It is produced for other ends, and that makes a difference, I think. And it's hard. I think it's increasingly hard to find those spaces. One of the reasons why it's important to keep producing them. I'd be very interested to hear from Stéfan on this subject, because yours is a very institutionalized version of this space. And I wonder if you feel like there are tensions in the professionalization of research software, because Stéfan was not a research software engineer. He was a scholar who took to coding to pursue his intellectual ends. And some of the conversations that I've been in lately about the need to professionalize research software and institutionalize it, and, you know, all of the play will go in some sense. And so your description of your response to Voyant was delightful, because, you know, you're obviously not shutting down the play, but do you feel some pressure towards that, and you know, will there remain a place for this kind of work?
C'est une vraie tension, et c'est très compliqué parce que quand il faut, j'aime pas le mot, mais le mot est pas le bon, mais j'ai que celui-là, on parle, nous, d'industrialisation. C'est-à-dire, alors le mot, il n'est pas exact, parce qu'on est quand même, Humanum, c'est une petite équipe, mais quand on dit industrialisation, on pense en fait pouvoir servir un très grand nombre d'utilisateurs, les accompagner, et surtout avoir une capacité de passage à l'échelle, c'est-à-dire de pouvoir imaginer la courbe de progression que le dispositif socio-technique, que l'outil va prendre dans une communauté. C'est-à-dire que, Marcello l'a dit, c'est construire, ou Kim l'a dit ce matin, construire une communauté de pratique. Et quand cette communauté de pratique, elle arrive à une certaine maturité et qu'il faut la doter, et que tout le monde a besoin de cette technologie en même temps, à la fois individuellement, en collectif, c'est là où l'industrialisation à l'échelle d'une infrastructure se pose. Et alors la tension, je n'ai pas la réponse, mais je crois que Kim l'a dit dans une de ses diapos ce matin, c'est d'arriver à construire une réponse ou une construction socio-technique où la vision et la parole des uns et des autres en tant que métier, c'est-à-dire les ingénieurs, les développeurs, les sysadmins, les chercheurs, parlent à égalité. Et c'est très important pour pour construire une infrastructure, c'est arriver à faire en sorte que les compétences des uns et des autres soient à part égale. Et c'est très difficile. Moi, je trouve que c'est très difficile. Parce que en développement informatique, le changement d'une technologie, d'un langage, par exemple, ou l'arrivée d'un nouveau langage de programmation qui va. Moi, je me souviens quand il y a eu le renouveau du JavaScript il y a quelques années, tous les développeurs avec qui je travaillais à Humanum regardaient ça en me disant qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est n'importe quoi. JavaScript avait tellement mauvaise réputation qu'il a fallu quelques années parce que finalement, les gens reviennent à JavaScript et à se remettre à travailler dessus. Parce qu'il y avait des informaticiens chez moi, ils regardaient JavaScript, ils avaient connu JavaScript dès la fin des années 90 et tout le monde rigolait beaucoup. Et donc ça, c'est très compliqué parce que c'est la clé de la réussite, elle est là. C'est arriver à dire aux développeurs, aux sysadmins, à tous les gens qui travaillent à l'industrialisation d'un outil. Il faut faire la part des choses entre ce qu'on amène comme compétences dans l'outil, mais aussi être capable de dire oui, mais tiens, ce besoin-là, il faut que je vais y répondre. Et donc, il faut que j'écoute ce besoin-là. Et ça, moi, je trouve que c'est très difficile. Enfin, c'est très difficile pour construire une communauté qui porte un outil et qui l'abandonne quelque part. Alors, quand c'est individuel, c'est encore plus compliqué, mais qui l'abandonne à un groupe qui va le développer, qui va le reprendre, l'améliorer, l'industrialiser, etc. C'est assez difficile. Dans l'expérience du Manum, j'ai des succès, j'ai des échecs. Et je suis bien en peine toujours pour dire qu'est-ce qui a fait que ça a marché à un moment donné et qu'est-ce qui a fait qu'à un moment donné, ça n'a pas marché. Donc, c'est un peu difficile à... Voilà. Et l'hypothèse que je fais toujours, c'est que c'est très humain. C'est-à-dire que et c'est un peu ce que je disais dans le début de ma présentation, l'impression que j'ai eue la première fois que j'ai rencontré Stéphane dans Saint-Michel, c'est que souvent les gens ils partagent un socle de pensée. Moi, je sais qu'avec Stéphane, c'était le web, vraiment la passion du web, quoi. Et je pense que pour que ça marche, il faut que les gens ils aient un minimum ils se reconnaissent en fait mutuellement en disant mais ça c'est intéressant, on va le développer. Il faut arriver à créer les conditions de ça. C'est assez fragile, c'est un moment souvent assez fragile. C'est compliqué.
I want to say a couple of things about community. How many of you remember the bamboo project? so that project was trying to build community, but the building included disciplining. I was at one meeting, only one, in which somebody got up, I remember, and said, there's almost you amateur projects need to stop. We're going to do it right. And all of the universities should stop giving money to all the little ones, and you just all pay your subscription to Bamboo. And Quentin Sponsky has written a great article. So community building is not always pretty. Sometimes it involves shutting things down, and sometimes it fails. The second thing is, I think, a very important part of the stack of infrastructure. And I'm very aware of the stack right now as I try to figure out how to support Voyant and Spyral and other projects. And there's layers. I mean, Stefan and I have gotten credit. I mean, he more than I struggled at times, but we have gotten credit. We both got tenure and stuff. But there's a whole series of caregivers that are not recognized. The people in the library, the people in computing services, the people in Compute Canada, the people, the janitors who keep our offices. There's a whole stack of people that are not recognized. And I think we have to recognize all those people and the care that they give and who we give credit to.
S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, l'heure est plus ou moins arrivée pour la fin de notre journée. Donc, je vous remercie beaucoup, je remercie les publics. Et donc, voilà, ça a été une première journée Stéfan Sinclair. Il y en aura d'autres. Je pense que c'est vraiment, comme on l'a vu aujourd'hui, je crois que la figure de Stéphane est parfaite pour représenter ce qu'on voudrait être en tant que communauté de Digital Humanities, comme tu le disais. Donc, je pense que c'est une occasion, une très belle occasion pour honorer Stéphane, mais aussi pour penser à ce que nous voulons être en tant que communauté. Donc, voilà, j'espère que nous aurons d'autres journées, Stéphane Sinclair, avec lesquelles réfléchir ensemble. Donc, merci encore à Kim pour sa conférence de ce matin. Merci à tous et à la prochaine fois.